Imagine a grand palace filled with history and whispers. A king sits at a beautiful mahogany table, his face tight with exhaustion. His wife and his sister are locked in a bitter war, and the whole institution is about to crack. Then, a sound like a gunshot echoes through the corridors. The king has slammed his hand down on the table, and the battle lines are finally drawn. This is a story about power, about pride, and about a queen who learned that duty is stronger than love. It all started with a briefing, a simple meeting about who walks into a room first, but behind that simple question was a war for control of the monarchy. King Charles had been under crushing strain for weeks. Every handshake, every arrival sequence, every tiny decision is loaded with political symbolism. And Princess Anne, who spent decades earning her reputation as the no-nonsense workhorse of the family, walked into that briefing and started asking questions that made the whole carefully constructed plan wobble. She wanted to know why a ceremonial order that is supposed to be governed by strict royal protocol had suddenly become a matter of personal preference. She was not yelling, not dramatic, not even particularly confrontational. She was just being Princess Anne, which means she was being calmly, implacably correct in front of an audience of staff. And that right there, that instinct, is what lit the fuse. Because Camilla, the queen consort, the woman who fought for decades to be seen as a centerpiece of the monarchy rather than an add-on, watched her own staff defer to Anne. She saw them wait for the Princess Royal's opinion. She felt the authority she had worked so hard to build just drain away, overpowered by the quiet presence of her sister-in-law standing there with a lifetime of Windsor discipline in her posture. One aide reportedly became deeply interested in the carpet. Another froze with a pen hovering over his notebook. The air got so thick with unspoken threat that everyone in that corridor knew this was not about scheduling anymore. It was about rank, about respect, about that incredibly thin line between personal pride and institutional duty. So when Camilla finally snapped, and she did snap, she railed in a voice shrill with accusation, blaming Anne for purposefully weakening the queen's position and embarrassing her in a formal discussion. The words were cold and harsh, dropping into that frigid silence like stones. And here is where the story takes its first really interesting turn. Princess Anne did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She just stood there with that serene, immovable reserve that she inherited directly from Queen Elizabeth II. And that stillness, that refusal to engage in the emotional chaos, was somehow more devastating than any counterattack could have been. Camilla's rage struck against it like flint against steel, and the sparks flew everywhere except where she wanted them to land. Now King Charles was watching all of this unfold, and his face apparently transformed in a way that genuinely frightened the people in the room. He was not a troubled husband or a weary king in that moment. He was a monarch watching a revolt happen in real time at the heart of his court. He realized with painful clarity that the damage was not private anymore. It was institutional. His wife had just attacked his sister in front of the very personnel whose loyalty keeps the crown functioning. And he understood that if he did not act decisively, the whole apparatus of royal authority would start to crumble. So he did something that feels almost theatrical in its intensity. He slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, the crack of impact reverberating down the corridor like a gunshot, and his voice came out deep and guttural with wrath as he ordered everyone out except Anne and Camilla. The assistants scrambled, grateful for the escape, but one household secretary who had been there for decades turned back for one last look. And what he saw was the king staring not at his sister with anxiety or at the empty doorway with embarrassment, but straight at his wife. And his face was one of unmitigated rage. That single glance communicated something terrifying. The monarch was not angry about a petty family squabble. He just watched his crown's authority collapse in the eyes of the people whose devotion is essential to its survival. And he knew the real crisis was just beginning. But to understand why Charles reacted so violently, you have to go back a few days earlier. Because the secret trigger for this whole explosion happened at a private rehearsal for a major state event. There were no shouts, no open conflict, just a simple adjustment that became a discreet transfer of power in a room full of individuals who understood exactly where true authority still lay. State receptions are the great theater of the monarchy. Geopolitical events where the hierarchy of the British state gets placed on display. The procession order, that prescribes sequence of who enters when and where they stand, is a document that speaks directly to power, precedence, and royal favor. Camilla had arrived at that rehearsal believing the order had finally been worked out in her favor. She had authorized a new arrangement that moved attendants she preferred closer to the front. This minor alteration was not just logistical to her. It was a fundamental confirmation of her authority, a public acknowledgement that she was truly queen. Princess Anne spotted the discrepancy immediately. She glanced at the order of procession and her face stiffened just enough for the equerry standing nearby to understand that a severe blunder had been made. According to a documented report later produced for senior advisors, a misstep in the procession could cause public shame or worse, a diplomatic snub. Anne was not about to let that slide. She did not make a speech or try to shame anyone. She simply stated with factual precision that the suggested modification was against protocol. And protocol here is not some dusty etiquette book. It is the rules that defend the dignity of the crown from the corrosive effect of human whim. Camilla had a small, tight smile on her face that did not reach her eyes, because the correction had been delivered right in front of the personnel she was trying to lead. The cruelest part from her perspective was that Anne's behavior was unimpeachable. The Princess Royal had been cool, precise, and utterly impossible to accuse of stirring up trouble, but the staff's reaction was swift and telling. Without waiting for a nod or any confirmation from Camilla, they moved to implement Anne's correction. That quick, unspoken obedience stung worse than any insult ever could. Then King Charles, without meaning to, made the wound fester. In a private exchange later, he commended his sister for her alertness, thanking her for averting a procedural slip that could have tarnished the crown's image. This statement of thanks was documented in the official household account of the day's events. Camilla learned about it because she overheard two staff members discussing the king's praise by a service stairway. She heard that Anne had been cited for correcting her. She heard that Charles had taken his sister's side. She heard that the palace, the institution she now technically headed as queen, had quietly and efficiently chosen the icy discipline of procedure over her personal desires. From that moment on, she carried the shame like a hidden blade. So when Anne questioned the domestic order in the corridor days later, Camilla was not responding to one sentence about scheduling. She was exacting revenge for a hurt that had grown intensely, poisonously personal. The second confrontation started with a pregnant pause. Anne put her briefing paper down. Camilla looked at the workers who looked at Anne. Charles looked from one woman to the other and tragedy broke across his face. When Camilla spoke, everyone in that room understood this was no longer about logistics. This was a naked grab for power. And before Charles could intercede or soften the moment, Camilla physically placed herself between the king and his sister, which is a gross violation of protocol because the monarch is supposed to be the final arbiter of disputes, not a spectator to be shielded. Her voice started low and controlled but intensified quickly. She accused Anne of always making her feel like an outsider, of hiding personal contempt behind the intricate constraints of convention. Anne did not engage. She just stared at Camilla with a deep, quiet, disappointed calm that seemed to unnerve the queen consort more than any screaming rebuttal ever could. Anne was keenly aware of her audience, knew the staff were listening, knew Charles was watching, understood that one wrong phrase could make the situation spiral beyond anyone's control. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and quiet, and it just made Camilla seem louder, more emotional, more exposed. Then came the crowning accusation. Camilla said Anne had spent years disguising her judgment beneath a mask of duty, making everyone else feel small while claiming simply to protect the crown. The charge hung in the air and Anne let the stillness stretch. Let everyone feel its weight before dropping a 5-word response that would blow the entire situation apart. Duty was all that kept the crown alive. Simple words, devastating in their precision. It was not just a defense of her own actions. It was a dramatic invocation of their mother's entire reign. A subtle but undeniable contrast between the late queen's unflinching stoicism and the emotional upheaval now unfolding in that corridor. This phrase broke the king. Charles jumped up so suddenly that his chair scraped noisily over the polished floor, the sound shattering the icy silence, and he commanded Camilla to desist, not as a husband asking for quiet, but as a monarch striving to save his authority from total disintegration. Camilla turned to him with an expression of amazement and expectancy. Witnesses said, apparently waiting for him to come to her aid, or at least blame Anne for taking the conflict too far. But in his eyes, she saw something far worse than fury. She witnessed the cold calculation of a decision being made. In the monarchy, every private hurt must eventually be brought under institutional control. The institution does not survive on love. It survives on a clear, unquestioned chain of authority. Charles now faced a choice he could no longer avoid: protect his wife from public disgrace or protect the institution from the appearance of being run by personal spite. Either option would cut him deeply. Only one would save the crown. After the confrontation, Charles retreated to his study with the sounds of the quarrel still ringing in his ears. A few minutes later, the household secretary, the palace's chief official for internal management, entered and laid a single piece of paper on the king's desk, a written report of the incident. This was no longer a family feud. It was institutionalized, documented, formalized. The harsh, lifeless wording of the official report made the event seem even more stark. Noting Camilla's statements, Anne's reserve, the presence of attendants, and the precise time the king had ordered the room evacuated. Such a paper exists to ensure senior officials receive an accurate factual description of occurrences, and its mere presence meant the incident could not be ignored or wished away. If the monarch remained silent or inactive, the entire household would read it as weakness. Elsewhere in the palace, Anne waited. She asked for no apology, sought no penalty, sent no messages through back channels. Her reserve was her dignity, and it spoke volumes. She had been assaulted in public for defending the values she believed preserved the monarchy, but she would not make her personal injury a public spectacle. Charles knew this. He also knew that her self-possession had made Camilla's outburst look catastrophically damaging by comparison. The staff had seen one senior royal lose her composure and another maintain her dignity under fire, and the contrast was devastating. For decades, Charles had shielded Camilla from public scorn, from the judgment of his own family, from the weight of history itself. Now he was being required to reprimand the woman he dedicated his life to protecting. His hand rested on the summary, his eyes distant, grasping the bleak reality. Love might explain his wife's uneasiness, but it could not justify the damage her actions had inflicted on the crown. When the decision came, it was executed with calm bureaucratic efficiency. Charles put away the incident account, grabbed the next planning document for the engagement, and with one stroke of his pen, removed Camilla's name from its oversight. He told the household secretary that the Princess Royal would personally oversee the final ceremonial order. This was a crippling blow. Control of the ceremonial order is a direct demonstration of the monarch's trust, and Camilla had yearned for that responsibility as proof of her acceptance. She lost that trust because of what Anne did and how she herself reacted. The secretary, fluent in the language of palace power, took the directive without question, and from that new descent, Charles understood everything he needed to know. The palace understood it, too. The decision was not emotional anymore. It was institutional. But the sentence did not arrive with a loud announcement. It came, as these things always do in royal circles, in the form of a single amended briefing document presented by an aide who could not quite meet Camilla's eyes. When she saw Princess Anne's name where hers should have been, she felt the room close in around her. The new household order was a subtle masterpiece of cruelty. It did not chide her or accuse her or even mention the confrontation. It simply, cleanly, irrevocably removed her from the center of authority. Her first emotion was humiliation, quickly followed by disbelief. The great impersonal machinery of the palace had turned against her, and the quiet efficiency of the punishment was colder and more final than any angry argument could ever be. She gripped the paper tighter and asked the aide one question. Had Anne requested this? The assistant hesitated just for a second, but that second stretched into an eternity, and it was all the answer she needed before he told her the order came from the king himself. That was the real blow. A standing feud with Anne was one thing. A clear snub from her husband, the king, was another. It meant he had not just failed to protect her, he had actively sided against her and corrected her. He left her alone with the folded paper and the dreadful awareness that the household had already accepted the new reality. She might still wear the crown and be called queen, but inside the palace where real authority resides, a critical responsibility had been stripped from her and handed to the exact woman she considered her adversary. When Charles came to her chamber later, he came alone. He closed the door behind him, and the faint click of the latch seemed to end the public performance they had both been maintaining. The kingdom dissolved for a moment, leaving nothing but a husband and wife trapped in a truth neither could escape. Camilla demanded to know why Anne had been protected so fast and so thoroughly. Why was the Princess Royal allowed to remain unscathed while she, the queen consort, was left to endure the dishonor of a public correction? Her voice was heavy with wrath and anguish. Charles listened, and his silence hurt more than an argument would have. He was not rushing to comfort her. He was measuring his words, aware that one careless statement could destroy whatever remained of their private and public collaboration. When he finally spoke, his words were exact and annihilating. He said Anne had not needed safeguarding. The crown, the institution of the monarchy itself, not just the people in it, had been damaged. They had not just witnessed an argument. They had seen anarchy at the top level, seen their king falter, and that faltering, even for a few seconds, presented an image of weakness that could be catastrophic to his rule. Camilla winced at the word duty, the same word Anne had used as a weapon against her. She told Charles that Anne's calm demeanor made her feel constantly judged, made her believe her mere existence was a judgment on her own legitimacy. It was a startling revelation of the insecurity that had fueled her anger. Charles recognized her suffering, but he was unmoved. The damage had been done. He told her there would need to be a direct and formal apology to Anne, and then he walked out of the room, leaving her to face the reality that her next humiliation would not be a quiet bureaucratic one. It would be face to face. The final meeting was held in a smaller reception room, a formal environment with no comfort and no escape. Charles stood silent when Anne arrived. She entered with no air of victory, her expression serious, the attitude of someone who understood that even if she won, the institution might still lose. She wanted order restored, not revenge, and her restraint was a powerful reminder of why the staff and now the king had trusted her judgment. Camilla came last. She apologized for attacking Anne before the staff. The words came with obvious effort in a voice that had lost its fury. The statements were a confession of more than lost temper. They were an admission of catastrophic loss of control, an acknowledgement that her personal pride had defiled her regal duties. Anne accepted the apology with steady calm. Personal hurt, she answered, should never be allowed to overrule official responsibility. Then the king spoke, his voice carrying all the authority of the crown. He indicated that all future state events would have their ceremonial sequence directly overseen by Princess Anne. He made it plain that household authority was never to be confused with personal pride again. The sentence was final with no appeal. Camilla would remain queen, but Anne was now the official standard-bearer of discipline in the kingdom. The queen consort had the title. The princess royal possessed the institution's trust. The king loved his wife, but he had a duty to the crown that must not be broken. That final contrast, now formalized, resolved the crisis more clearly than any public punishment could have done. The controversy did not end in victory, but in terrible clarity. Camilla's attack had revealed the profound insecurity still hiding behind her crown. Anne's restraint had demonstrated why she remains the unshakable foundation of the royal family. Charles's initial hesitancy showed his fear, but his final harsh act of decision restored his authority. The lesson is as old as the monarchy itself. Crowns can survive wrath, betrayal, and scandal, but only if duty remains stronger than pride. The palace had remembered in the most painful way imaginable that genuine royal power is not found in who can shout the loudest. It is found in who can remain still when everything around them threatens to shatter.